All right, so good afternoon. Welcome to this quarterly webinar, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Aaron Blight, who is going to share with us from his very diverse experience of the home care sector, why caring is not only a business, but it can also be a philosophy that we can apply to our caregiver, to our employees. Aaron and I actually met very surprisingly, I guess, through LinkedIn. We've since then met in person, and Aaron has an amazing background. He worked for the government for several years at CMS. He then became an agency owner for about 10 years, and I know he's going to talk a little bit more about that. And he sold, somewhat reluctantly, I understand, his agency, and is now a professor of healthcare management and public health at Shenandoah Valley University. So I am now going to be quiet and turning over the presentation to Aaron.
Thank you, Annalise. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me on the call today. I'm just looking at, it looks like I do not have the ability to control the slides.
Okay, so I will be your slide master.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. It's great to be with you.
I have no sound, and I don't know why.
Really? Oh, can you hear me?
I can hear you, but we can also hear somebody who says they have no sound.
I heard that. Okay.
Go ahead, Aaron.
So, Annalise, I have a couple of slides here by way of background. And can you go ahead and go to the next slide? I'll tell you just a little bit about me. We can go to the next slide. As Annalise said, oh, go back one.
I tried clicking on those.
Might be just muted on our end.
There we go. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Okay.
The problem is somebody who's having trouble with that sound keeps unmuting themselves rather than turning on the sound volume on their end. So, but I can't control that. So.
Okay. Can you go back one slide? So I'd like to go back about 20 years when I was working at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. I was in the National Medicaid program, and I was leading policy for disabled and elderly health programs within the Medicaid world. If I'm being honest with you, I didn't have a clue what it meant to be elderly or disabled at that time. And things abruptly changed in our lives. You can go to the next slide. This is a picture of my mother-in-law. Excuse me. About 20 years ago, she was diagnosed unexpectedly with a brain tumor. She was given 6 to 9 months to live, and this is when I was at CMS. And our lives were just completely upended with her diagnosis. She moved into our home. She lived with us for a couple of years after brain surgery and then a subsequent brain surgery and radiation and chemotherapy. She lived a total of 5.5 years, but we were constantly caring for her during that 5.5-year period. My wife especially, and I was the backup caregiver and the nighttime caregiver. I learned a lot about caregiving and struggled a lot with it as a family. But this was a very important part of our experience, and it ultimately changed the direction of my career. A year after she died in 2005, we can go to the next slide, I was the head of finance for the federal Medicaid program and made a decision to leave CMS and become a home care provider. That was really prompted by about the last several weeks of my mother-in-law's life. She was a client of the Visiting Angels, and we just wish that we had called them sooner. They dramatically improved the quality of our life as a family. We were able to focus more on the emotional aspects of what was happening with her, with my mother-in-law, as opposed to all of the physical tasks of caregiving. And so that prompted me to enter the industry. I became a franchisee for Home Instead Senior Care. And my business, and I was motivated by a desire to help families that were just like mine. My business grew and grew and grew, and it did very well. I got to the point that I had almost 400 caregivers that worked for me, and was one of the largest companies in the entire franchise system within home instead senior care. In 2017, you can go to the next slide, Annalise. Oh, I'm sorry. Got to cover this first. So while I was running my home care company, I had an issue with caregiver turnover, like I'm sure everybody here on this slide, on this call has.
Nothing has changed.
And I decided to go back to school and get a doctoral degree. My doctorate degree is in human and organizational learning. It's an interdisciplinary degree that focuses on leadership, culture, change, and adult learning. And it's targeted, really oriented toward life and organizations. And for my dissertation, I decided to study home care workers to try to understand what motivates them to want to continue to stay in the role of caregiver. I was really seeking to address a turnover issue and have some pragmatic research that I could use and apply in my own business. And some of what's underneath that I'm going to share with you today, not in an academic way, but in a way that hopefully everybody can understand and relate to. And so then a few years later, after I finished my doctorate degree, my life changed. August 1st, 2017 is the day that I sold my home care company. As Annalise indicated, I wasn't really looking to do this, but a gentleman from Texas reached out to me and asked me if I was interested in selling. I said, no, not really. My business is going great. Why would I do that? And he said, well, somebody referred me to you and said you might want to sell your business. And I said, well, I really don't, but I'll talk to you. The only way that I would talk to you is if you, the only way I would sell my business is if you were to make a premium offer. And we talked about what that would look like. And after about a month of conversations, lo and behold, he actually made a premium offer. And I was not prepared for that. Did not expect that. It's one thing to know in your mind what your business is worth. It's something totally different for someone to come and say, I will pay you this. So I did some deep soul searching. I talked to my wife, talked to God, talked to my professional advisors, and ultimately decided to sell my business. But I didn't have a plan B. And so then my question was, well, what do I do next? And between the family caregiving, the policy background and national healthcare policy, the provider background as a home care provider, and also in my academic training, I realized really what I need to do is go out and talk about caregiving, about the giving and receiving of care. And so that's what I've been doing since. And that's led me to Caregiving Kinetics, and that's how I met Annalise. So we'll go to the next slide. So today, I just want to make a comment going in that, having been in the home care industry, I know that there's a lot of discussion that is very tactical about leading a home care company. I would go to meetings and conferences and workshops and walk out with a list of suggestions about things that I could do tactically to improve my business. And that's all wonderful. Tactical efforts are important to grow your business. But what was really lacking in a lot of those discussions is the deeper underlying issues that we have to think about in home care. And what I'm hoping to do today is to help to talk a little bit about some of the deeper issues beyond the tactical, to help you think more deeply about home care. And I think that as you think more deeply about what's happening and you consider what's happening underneath the surface in your company, you're going to be a better leader and you're going to be more successful, and you're going to know how to adapt and change things to improve your operation. So when it comes to care, Caring is what you do in a home care company, right? So I want to talk about the word care for a minute, okay? Because care is a noun and care is also a verb. So what is care as a noun? Well, this is what the dictionary says. Care as a noun is the activity, skill, or profession of looking after someone who needs help or protection. Okay, everybody agree with that? Let's go to the verb. The definition, according to the dictionary, of care as a verb is to be interested in someone, to want them to be well and happy. Let's go to the next slide. So if you think about care as a noun versus care as a verb, the orientation for care as a noun is responsibility. The focus in care as a noun is on action, and the potential result of just thinking about care strictly as a noun is objectification of the care receiver. Because when you think about care as a noun, you're saying, well, I have this responsibility, this duty, this professional role where I have to oversee things for this person, and I'm being compensated for it, right? In terms of care as a verb, the orientation is more toward a relationship. The focus of care as a verb is on your motivation. Why are you providing that care? Is it because you genuinely care about that person, or is it not? The result of caring as a verb is humanization. The care receiver, the person who is the aim of your care, is more likely to be viewed as a human being and less as an object. Let's go to the next slide. So let's put that on hold for a minute and ask, well, is caring a business? Well, let's go back again to the dictionary definition of a business. A commercial or sometimes an industrial enterprise. Dealings or transactions, especially of an economic nature. Let's go to the definition. The next question, is caring actually, is it a philosophy? Go to the definition of a philosophy. One more. A philosophy is the most basic beliefs, concepts, and attitudes of an individual or a group. So when you think about caring as a business, can you go to the next slide? There's sort of this this duality in home care that we experience. On the one hand, we are involved in an economic transaction. But on the other hand, we're expected to serve with our hearts. And there can be a little bit of an inherent tension in that. And this actually pervades healthcare. It's kind of interesting. At Shenandoah University, I teach classes in healthcare management and public health. And every semester, I show these two little graphics to the class. I show them these graphics at the beginning of the class and at the end of class. And I ask, just by a showing of hands, which slide do you think more accurately reflects healthcare? And it seems like the classes in the business school, when I have a lot of business school students, because my healthcare management classes are through the business school, but we have business students, we have other pre-med or health professions folks, or biology majors, or sports medicine majors, people like that. But the business folks always vote for the left-hand side. And then a lot of others, especially people in public health, vote on the right-hand side. So it's very interesting. But the point is that when we're involved in this business of home care, we have to recognize that these two elements create this kind of this situation where we're being paid to care, to provide care, the noun, but the expectation is that we actually do care, the verb. So let's go to the next slide. Here's the thing. Here's the rub. People know when you actually care about them. Does everybody agree with that? If you're with another human being, you can pretty much tell whether or not they care about you. Go ahead and click the next one, Annalise. In return, they care about you. So when somebody knows that you care about them, they're also more likely to care about you. So let's go to the next slide. A business of caring must exemplify a philosophy of caring. It's the very nature of your business. If you are simply oriented toward transactions, if you treat the people that you care for as objects, you're a hypocrite. People will see right through that. People will question your motivation for being in this business. This is not selling shoes. You can sell a shoe and be purely transactional and not have any kind of care about the, verb, but not really in home care. Oh, sorry, that's my phone. Let's go to the next slide. So let me, stop. Yeah, go right there. So I'd like to just have you think for a minute, who do you care for and who do you care about? So, the initial thought there would be, well, we care for seniors, right? For elderly people who need help with activities of daily living, who are vulnerable, who can't, who need companionship and assistance at home. And then this question is, how do you care for them? And let's think for a minute about how we care for them. Can we go to the next slide? This has to do with the structure of caring in home care. You really think about it, the way that we care for our clients is through our caregivers. The home care agency has some initial contact with the client to set up service, to do the initial assessment, to create the care plan, maybe to do some quality assurance visits over time. But the vast majority of the time, 98% of the time, that the company is interacting with the client is through the hands and the eyes of the caregiver. So the home care agency interacts with the caregiver and sends the caregiver to the client's home. So it's through the caregiver that the client's needs are met and that we are caring for the client. Go to the next slide. So go back to this question then. Who do you care for? Who do you care about? How do you care? And because of the structure of home care, this second question, this fourth question is, I think, really important. Can you hit that one, Annalise? Do you care for and do you care about your caregivers as much as your clients? So I mentioned earlier that my motivation to go into home care was to help seniors and their families that were dealing with situations like mine. After a while, I started to realize that the caregivers that worked for me, they were human beings too. They had a lot of challenges, and that I could make a huge difference in their lives just by offering them this opportunity to work and to have meaningful work. And I started to care about my caregivers as much as my clients. And in some ways, I interacted with my caregivers a lot more than my clients. So let's go to the next slide. Now, this is something that you got to remember. Caregivers know when you actually care about them. And in return, they will care about you. Next slide. So this is something that I'm going to portray some of the knowledge that I gained through my research, through my dissertation, as I studied home care workers. I looked at home care workers all across the country. I fortunately had access to the entire Home Instead Senior Care Network. We had caregivers in 30 different agencies that were the subject of my study, hundreds of them that participated in my survey. And what I found is that when the home care agency, that So one question that I had fundamentally in my dissertation research is that for our home care workers, is caregiving a job or is it a relationship? It's kind of a profound question, right? And there are implications, however you answer that. But the caregiver spends so much of their time in the homes of clients. They develop a relationship with their client. And the degree to which that relationship with that client is important to the caregiver will be a fundamental motivating factor for the caregiver to continue in the role. Is caregiving a job? Well, at the same time, the people that are signing the check for the caregiver are with the home care agency. And is membership in that home care agency an important part of that caregiver's identity? These two words that are on here, organizational identification and relational identification, they're actually academic terms. They're found in the research, and they are reflections of the degree to which a relationship is an integral part of a person's identity, or the degree to which membership in an organization is an integral part of a person's identity. What the research shows is that as home care agencies demonstrate care for their caregivers, caregivers find membership in that organization to be increasingly important. They value being a part of a company that cares about them. They're more likely to continue working for a company that cares about them. They're more likely to do favors for a company that cares about them. So when when you have that call off and you're trying to fill a shift and you call that caregiver and ask, would you be willing to do this? I know it's the last minute, but can we send you out to Mrs. Jones's home tonight? If that caregiver likes you and feels that you care about them, they are more willing to step up and help you. So that's what organizational identification is all about. So when caregivers not only give care, but also receive care from the home care agency, the home care agency receives the reward. Let's go to the next slide. Can we go to the next slide?
Yes. So I think that's summarizing what you just said here.
Yeah, business of caring needs to exemplify a philosophy of caring for clients and for employees. Now, when I say exemplify, it doesn't mean simply talking the talk. Because if you talk the talk, but you don't walk the walk, people will see right through that. And people will become cynical and criticize you and say, oh yeah, they know, they say the right things, but we know what really motivates them. We know what they really care about. All that they care about is money, or all that they care about is themselves, okay? But if you demonstrate a philosophy of caring to your employees, then your employees will become your greatest advocates. They will rave about how much you care, not only for the clients, but also for them. Let's go to the next slide. What is a philosophy of caring? Well, let's just take the definitions that we were just using and come up with what a philosophy of caring is. The basic belief and attitude that not only do you have a duty to look after one who needs help, but you also genuinely want the person as a human and not as an object to be happy. That's a philosophy of caring. Next slide. So how do you see, how can you perceive a philosophy of caring? The organization's philosophy of caring is reflected in its culture. And a culture of caring is a manifestation of underlying beliefs and a philosophy of caring. So the remainder of the presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about organizational culture, and I'm hopefully going to help you understand a little bit more what is organizational culture and how do you shape it. There's a little bit of I've read some things where some people think that, well, organizational culture is something that is just, you just write value statements and mission statements and that's it. That's your culture. And organizational culture is much more than that. Organizational culture is not simply something that the leader says, although the leader has a huge influence over organizational culture. Just because the leader says that the organizational culture is this way does not make it so. Organizational culture is a reflection of the shared values and assumptions of the people in the organization. So this is a little bit of a model here from Edgar Schein, who was an organizational scholar. And he talked about organizational culture being rooted in assumptions, values, and artifacts. Assumptions are taken for granted beliefs about the world. Assumptions are not even overtly expressed. They're just assumed. They don't, they're so obvious to people that they don't even bother talking about them. And they are the deepest and most profound components, the foundational components of an organization's culture. Values can be expressed and visible, or they can be invisible. Values might be written in value statements. They could be verbally expressed. They could be written on the wall. But they also could be things that aren't overtly expressed, but are just understood. Artifacts are visible manifestations of culture. And artifacts exist in the physical world. They can be seen, they can be heard, and they're subject to interpretation and bias by individual people. So let's just, this seems a little bit abstract. Let's just give an example here. Can we go to the next slide? So the next slide, this is a key, okay? And so this is an artifact. It's something that we can see. The key shows, it's a reflection of certain values, right? People have keys because they value security, safety, and peace of mind. So if you have a key, you probably have that for security, safety, and peace of mind. Well, there's an assumption that's underneath having that key. Your assumption is, well, your stuff is actually valuable and that somebody will steal it without that key. Now, those assumptions may or may not be true. We go to the next slide. Your key could be locking the door to this place. Now, when I look at that, I have no desire to steal any of that. To me, none of it seems like it's valuable at all. And so the assumption is not really on point, but the owner of this place has a key and is protecting their stuff. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So here's another thing. The scholars came in after Edgar Schein and said, well, and Mary Jo Hatch is one of the leading scholars here, said, well, you know what? Artifacts, they actually have symbolic meaning. Artifacts are actually symbols. And we interpret things about our values and assumptions because of artifacts. Or artifacts are a reflection of our values and assumptions. So let's use another example. Let's go to the next slide. We're sticking here again with the theme of a key. So on the left-hand side, you see a key. This is an old key from Europe. It goes back to the 19th century. And if you just look at that key, you can think of certain things that symbolizes, right? Oldness, tradition, history. The key on the right, it is a key, but it looks like a credit card, right? And as you look at that, you know immediately that's a key to a hotel room. It's got the Marriott brand on it. It symbolizes modernity. I mean, you know, hotels these days don't have really keys like those on the left, right? Mostly what you see are these these credit card keys. It's a symbol of technology. And look at even the message on that card. You hold the power to open doors. I mean, think about the symbolism there, the power of opening a door, okay? This is a reflection of our culture. And there's an assumption made, probably by Marriott and some of these hotels, that people want modern technology to protect their rooms. But, you know, I was just at a conference with Annalise last week, and as I was checking in, I was behind a gentleman at the front desk. And he walked up to the front desk and he turned over his key that looked just like the one on the right. And he said, "This darn key will not open my room door." And the front desk agent apologized and said, "Oh, did you have it close to your cell phone?" And he said, "Yeah, I did. It was in my pocket with my cell phone." And the darn thing wouldn't even work because of the mixing of technology, right? So he might have been better served by the key on the left in that instance. So these things are dynamic. Culture is a reflection of values and assumptions that may or may not be accurate in terms of the way that the world works. Now, some of the cultural researchers, as they started to look into organizational culture, they said, well, they realized that rather than it being a kind of a hierarchical thing like that, that all of these are interrelated, and that if you want to change organizational culture, one of the best ways to do that is to change organizational artifacts and change the symbols of your organization. So culture is it's a dynamic process of stability and change, and it's a process where it's always being shaped by things that are happening in the organization. Messages, symbols, signs, and this is the cultural dynamics model. I don't want to get too far into it, but I want to just point out that the idea here, and you could sort of infer from the chart, we could talk for an hour about this chart, but you can infer from the chart how all of these are interwoven. But the point is that artifacts are a way of creating symbols that help you to interpret assumptions about what's happening in the organization and in the world around you. So let's go to the next slide. What are some artifacts that show up in an organization? All of these things. This is not a comprehensive list, but all of these things are reflections of culture in an organization. Stories, employee benefits, gestures, the way that you greet one another, the equipment in your office, your furniture in your office, the car that you drive is a reflection of culture. The types of awards that you give to employees, reflection of culture. The signs, the things that are hanging on your wall in the office, those are a reflection of your organizational culture. So let's think a little bit more about this. I want to go into a couple of specific examples in home care. The telephone. What does the telephone represent to a home care company? Oh, can you hear my telephone is ringing right now.
Just on cue.
That's
This is
unbelievable.
beautiful. Nicely done then, Aaron.
So the phone to a scheduler can represent a ball and chain, or it can represent a lifeline, right? Mm-hmm. Let's go to the next slide. So here's a scheduler. And this is what the scheduler says. Go to the next, click it again. There you go. So this scheduler gets a phone call. And she's like, "That's great, just great. Another call off. Can this day possibly get any better?" She goes on to say, "I am so sick of this place. I don't know why all of our caregivers call off. They don't take their job seriously. At least I go home in 30 minutes. Oh, wait, no, go back. Sorry. So what's being reflected here in terms of her assumptions about the world? Okay. Look at her facial expressions. Look at her gesture with her hand. What is that indicating about her values and her assumptions about her work, her values and her assumptions about caregivers? Is she looking at a caregiver here as someone that she genuinely cares about? Or is the caregiver an object? Another interesting thing is she talks about, well, I don't know why all of our caregivers call up. And in my business, I actually heard this from some of our schedulers. Just because of a few call-offs, they would start ranting about all of the caregivers who called off. We know that that is just plain not true. You can have 97 caregivers out of 100 that perform their jobs perfectly, they're responsible, they show up, and then you have 3 call-offs in a day. And the schedulers rant and rave about the 3 call-offs and say, well, everybody, they all call up. Why do they all call up? And then suddenly it's infectious, right? Everybody in the office is talking about the caregiver problem. They all call up. They're all not dependable, okay? That is a reflection of your culture, your beliefs about the caregivers and your assumptions about them. And it's a reflection of how you relate to them. You're superior to them. They don't have value as human beings. They are objects to be moved around on a chessboard, just like a pawn or, a bishop or a rook. They're not human beings. So let's compare that to the next scheduler. This is Marissa. And when she talks about her job as a scheduler, she says no day is the same. Every day there are unexpected challenges. Sure, she recognizes that there are unexpected challenges, things like call-offs. But here's how she describes her work. I have really loved getting to know the community. I am loving being part of this team. I enjoy the feeling of being a part of a team that cares about the community around us and wants to make a difference. What assumptions is Marissa making about the organization and about the world around her? There's assumptions here about community, about team. Her enjoyment is evident. You could see just on the facial expressions that she likes working here. She's not unrealistic. She says, yeah, she knows that there are challenges, but she's prepared to face them in a positive way. Let's go to the next slide. So I want to talk about a couple of specific examples then in a home care company. And I want to talk for a minute about sales charts. Okay. So in my time, I've had a chance to go around and see a lot of home care companies. I've been in a lot of different offices, and some of them have sales charts that are displayed very prominently for everybody to see as they walk in and out of the office. And I would simply ask you, if you have a sales chart like that on display, what is that communicating about your values and your assumptions about home care? What is your team, what are your caregivers thinking when they see something like that? What are your potential clients thinking when they see something like that? Now, when you go into like a car dealership, you expect to see a sales chart, right? We're entrusted with the lives of vulnerable human beings, and our service is delivered by human beings. So what is that sales chart really communicating about our assumptions concerning our business and our philosophy of caring? I'm not saying that you shouldn't have a sales chart, because sales charts certainly have a purpose. But the point is, what do you have hanging on your walls in your office? And what are those things communicating in terms of your philosophy of care? Let's go to the next slide. This is a picture of a painting that I actually hung in my office in my home care company. And if you if you can read the little plaque underneath it says Esther Doble, a client of our company, painted this picture when she was 95 years old. I met Esther Doble. She's a delightful woman. She's actually still alive. She's 105 years old.
Wow.
But at 95, she painted this. I bought it. I purchased this from her. And the reason that I bought that, I mean, number one, I wanted to support Esther Doble because she's just an incredible woman. But number two is I was trying to address certain assumptions that our society makes about the value of a 95-year-old woman. Our society suggests, and I know this is harsh, but it's true, that a 95-year-old woman doesn't really have a lot to offer. She doesn't contribute anymore, and she really can't do something like this. Think of the dexterity that Esther Doble has in her hands to be able to paint that at 95 years old. Think of her vision. Think of the way that she is defying incorrect cultural assumptions. Think of simply by just putting this on display in my home care company, what I was trying to display is, the value of the dignity of life, the worth of an old soul, the capacity of an aging individual to actually produce something that is beautiful, that can be admired by others. And so this is not something that I explicitly said to anybody, but it's something that sits there in a very prominent place in our office, and it's a message to everyone who walks in the door. Let's go to the next slide. So I want to tell you about this. Back in 2008, I was looking for a Christmas present for our caregivers. And, every Christmas I would find a Christmas present. I was walking down the main, the pedestrian mall with old shops in his old historic Winchester, Virginia, and there was a pewter shop there. It's no longer in business. But I walked into the pewter shop and I saw this. And I said, oh my gosh, that would be an awesome Christmas present for caregivers because it symbolizes exactly what we do. We serve with our hands, but also with our hearts. And I thought about this and I thought, you know what? If I use that as a Christmas present, then it's one and done. I can't reuse it. And for Thanksgiving that year, we had this was in my mind, I was mulling this over. We had a caregiver named Craig, and he had been with a client, a veteran. And on Thanksgiving Day, Craig went in and delivered his normal service to the client, a rise and shine service, and then he clocked out. And after clocking out, he went out to his car and he brought in turkey, stuffing, green beans, mashed potatoes, and proceeded to make a full Thanksgiving dinner in the home of his client at his own expense on his own time. And the client was so touched by this. He was a widower, and he cried, and he said that this was the first time that his home smelled like Thanksgiving since his wife had died. And that meant everything in the world to this man. And that had just happened, and I just thought, what a remarkable thing Craig did for his client. And I realized that we have so many caregivers that do exceptional things like this all the time in my business, and I'm not recognizing that. How can we recognize that? So I decided not to give this away as a Christmas present that year. I went and found something else. To be honest, I don't even remember what I bought that year for the caregivers. But we created a new recognition, and it was called the Hand and Heart Award. Can you go to the next slide? So I bought 100 of those pewter pins, and then I went to a print shop and I created this little card that these pins went on, and the card has our logo and our location, and then on the back there's a little message that says something like, thank you for your exceptional acts of compassionate care. Congratulations on receiving this prestigious award, or something like this. And I wanted to use this as a way to recognize all of our caregivers. We had caregiver of the month, we had caregiver of the year, but that's 12 or 13 caregivers. We had a lot of caregivers and wanted to kind of liberally do this with all of our caregivers. I wrote a letter, sent the letter out to all of our clients and their families describing the award. sent it out to referral providers, sent it out to all of our caregivers, and said, starting January 1st of 2009, we're going to implement this new award. Please nominate your caregivers. The criteria was that this caregiver provided exceptional acts of compassionate care, and you could not nominate yourself. You had to be nominated by someone else. So we sent all those letters out, and after about 2 or 3 weeks, lo and behold, we got a nomination. We got a nomination from a client who lived down south. And she wrote about her caregiver. Caregiver's name was Gloria. Gloria is salt of the earth. Incredible woman. Christian woman. I would want her taking care of my parents. And my HR person came to me and says, oh, we got a nomination. We got our first nomination. What are we going to do? And I didn't know what we were going to do. I was like, It's kind of spontaneously, I just said, well, invite Gloria. Just tell Gloria to come into the office. So my HR person invited Gloria to come to the office, and we didn't know exactly when she was coming. A couple days later, Gloria came to the office. And my HR person comes running to my office, running to me, and she's like, Gloria's here. Gloria's here. What are we going to do? And you know how busy you get with home care, right? I wasn't really thinking about this at the time. I was so wrapped up in my crisis du jour that I hadn't even really planned out how I was going to handle this. So I was like, oh my gosh, Gloria's here. I don't know. Let's have a meeting. Okay. So Gloria's standing there, and I walked around the office and gathered every single person from the administrative staff who was there. And we formed a circle right there with Gloria in the middle of the circle, standing right next to me. And I had this little thing in my hand, and Gloria had no idea what was about to happen. And I said, I just gave a little speech. I said, today we gather here to honor Gloria. Gloria is a fantastic caregiver. In fact, let me read to you what Gloria's client said about her. And I had the nomination from the client, and I just read what the client said about Gloria. When I finished reading, I looked over at Gloria, and she was bawling. And then I looked around the circle, and everybody in the office was bawling. And then Gloria said,
that was an interesting success.
And then Gloria just went into this speech about how much she loves working here. And then the office staff started saying how much they love Gloria and the fact that Gloria works there. It was a kumbaya love fest. And I could not believe how impactful this was. I was crying. So that's how our Hand and Heart Award was born. And we made it an institutionalized thing. We started giving these out as many as we could. I would buy these pins in batches of 100 and use them all up. When we had caregiver meetings, our caregivers would come in wearing these things on their lanyards. We would have them stand up and be recognized when they got Hand and Heart Awards. We would announce the Hand and Heart Awards in the newsletter. And it became a badge of pride and honor. It was symbolizing the type of care that our caregivers delivered and the type of organizational culture that we wanted to establish. Service with hands, but also with hearts. So when I started, can you go back? Sorry. So when after I sold my company and was with Caregiving Kinetics, I realized, when I go out and speak to groups and speak to home care companies, I ought to just bring the Hand and Heart Award on the road. So today, when I go into a home care company, and if I'm speaking to caregivers with some coordination with the owner of the company, we make a similar thing happen. And it is a very memorable and very impactful moment for caregivers and for the staff and the whole team. And so it's an honor for me to continue to do that. Let's go to the next slide. So how do you create or foster a culture or philosophy of caregiving? And again, my goal here is to help you to think a little bit about what's happening in your organization and give you the eyes to see what needs to be done. The first thing is to observe. Just choose to be a keen observer in your organization. There's so much that you can learn simply by being quiet and just looking around at things. Look for artifacts in your organization and ask, well, what is this thing that I'm looking at a reflection of? Look at the business, the format of the office, the way the office is structured. Look at the things that are hanging on your walls. Look at the facial expressions of your employees. And number two, ask what are the underlying assumptions and values that are reflected in these observations that you make. And then think about the type of organizational culture that you want to create, that you want to foster. Then, once you know the type of culture that you want to create it. Develop new artifacts that reflect the type of culture and the type of assumptions and values that you want reflected in your organization. Make sure to incorporate symbols. Use symbolic meaning. Create stories that relate back to the culture that you want to create. And as you continue to reinforce that, and you'll reinforce it across different elements of the organization, and then repeat the same 5 things. Repeat it over and over again. You're continually refining and shaping the organizational culture this way. Or culture cannot be controlled. Culture is something that emerges over time. And as you consistently undertake this, you'll see that philosophy of caring more and more evidenced in your organization. I think that's it, Annalise. Is that
all right? Well,
is there one more slide?
There is a beautiful presentation. No, that is the end of your deck. So if I were to maybe summarize some of a couple of key points, I think that I want to reflect back to our audience today is that, although we know that intuitively your research, your doctoral research really support the fact that home care agencies who care for their caregivers, they're more likely to have caregivers invested in their agency. And also around the last point that you made, which I want to reemphasize as an HR professional, that we are all our culture agents, and that how we interact day in and day out will impact how we work together. So that's probably sort of my parting comments. We're coming to the top of the hour here this afternoon. My last question for you, Aaron, is people who might be interested to get more of you, want to work with you, what would be the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Yeah, so my website is caregivingkinetics.com. That's caregiving, KINETICS.
Yeah, we see it on the slide here on the bottom.
Oh, you
side.
have the slide. Yeah. Oh, okay, great. So you can reach out to me there. My email address is aaron@caregivingkinetics.com. I'm also on LinkedIn and I'm a reluctant tweeter. But I'd love to hear from you and hear what you think about the things that we discussed today.
Okay, very good. So thank you again for everybody for being on the call. And thank you, Aaron, very much for sharing those moving and fascinating stories with us this afternoon to make it all come alive.
Thank you, Annalise. Thanks,
all
everybody.
Right. Goodbye, everybody.